1832 was a constitutional opening for British politics. In the wake of the Great Reform Act that had abolished rotten and pocket boroughs, redistributed seats to growing industrial towns like Manchester and Birmingham, the election that followed consolidated advantages. In short, 1832 brought about Britain's democratic story. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Luke Blaxill to talk us through it. He's a historian and college lecturer specialising in 19th and 20th century British history at Hertford College, Oxford. Luke, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Ethan.
So I would like to start by you setting the context. How did the international political climate look coming out of the 1830 and 31 elections before us getting into the domestic?
Well, an extreme period of instability. Britain is used to looking across the Channel to France and events in France, particularly because of obviously the 1789 revolution. But in 1830, we have the July Revolution, where we see the end of the reactionary Bourbon monarchy. Charles X is forced to flee, and indeed he flees to Britain, and we have the establishment of a constitutional monarchy under Louis Philippe. There are also uprisings in Belgium, Poland, and Italy. But I think that the real concern for Britain here is that those revolutionary undercurrents are going to hit Britain at precisely the same time that there is all sorts of unrest and all sorts of questioning of the British political settlement, which has been going on really since 1815.
So looking from 1815 to now, how did it look domestically if there was such unrest?
Well, really, the ministry of Lord Liverpool, which came to an end in 1827, began in 1812, had seen a great deal of distress throughout Britain. There were certain economic reasons for this. You had the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a huge number of the population without jobs, agricultural depressions, and you see the question of reform, i.e. giving the vote to working class people, potentially middle class people, as being a key issue which unites the radical movement. You see a large number of run-ins between protesters with monster public meetings and indeed sometimes violent dissent and the authorities. The Patriarch's Rising, Sparfields, and of course the Peterloo Massacre in 1819. Now that is of course the famous and celebrated event where you have a large meeting on St. Peter's Field in Manchester, where the crowd had come to listen to Henry Orator Hunt, a key radical orator, and a Manchester regiment of hussars, commanded by a local magistrate, got into one of those very famous situations where they weren't given a direct order to charge, but someone threw a stone, and before you knew it, the cavalry were on top of the people, and there were a large number of fatalities. And that was used as a real cause célèbre by the radical movement to explain how it was that the government, as they saw it, not that it was the government, were against the people in crushing reform. There was also all sorts of domestic censorship, the Six Acts, gagging restraints, the suspension of habeas corpus, and a real period of danger. That died off a bit in the 1820s during an economic boom, but it is starting to resurface in precisely the same year as we see these international events here in France. And this second wave of radical uprising is much more dangerous than the first and sees all sorts of widespread rioting. And so the government really feels as though it is being pushed into action.
And why did it appear so intolerable to towns and cities such as Manchester and Birmingham that they were so underrepresented?
That's absolutely a key point, Ethan. It's not just that lots of people didn't have the vote, as was the case. We have a franchise of between 5 to 9% of the population. It is also that key industrial metropolises that were becoming influential, growing in population, growing in economic importance due to the Industrial Revolution and the revolution in steam, the revolution indeed even in water power prior to that, weren't left with no MPs. They had MPs by dint of, say, being in counties like Manchester, for example, but they didn't have dedicated borough MPs. And yet at the same time, you had medieval towns, for example, the constituency of Dunwich, which had fallen into the sea, the borough of Old Sarum, which was just a field with no one living there, that returned two MPs. And so there was a real mismatch, not just between the people who could vote and who couldn't, but where the centres of democratic representation lay. Almost all of the MPs were coming out of places that had formerly been significant in medieval times, with a huge skew towards agricultural and market towns that were important in the 14th and 15th century. But those did not reflect modern Britain. And the most egregious example of that is Manchester not having any MPs, despite it being a burgeoning industrial metropolis.
And so Robert Peel at the time described it as a moral storm. In relation to both the international uprising and especially the domestic pressure, what was meant when he said those words?
Well, Peel, of course, was a famous opponent of reform in 1832. And so when Peel called it a moral storm, he was actually really saying it was just that. A storm is something that blows everything around, but a storm passes and then can be followed by a period of calm. But what he was specifically talking about was an enormous wave of monster meetings, demonstrations, riots, just massive surge of political consciousness that we saw this, in the days of May, immediately before the Reform Act, monster meetings happening everywhere, and widespread rioting with large numbers of fatalities in places like Bristol. But of course, what increasingly happens is those who want to carry reform, those who are opposed to Robert Peel's opposition of it, say, excuse me, Mr. Peel, this isn't a moral storm, this is a real storm. And we can see the Duke of Newcastle's castle burning in Nottingham, and we need to do something before the crowd come and set fire to ours.
This appears almost as elites attempting to save their aristocratic influence, save their castles from being burnt down. How much so was this them attempting to save their own skin comparatively?
I think it is an overwhelmingly powerful sentiment in 1832. It is really the only of the Reform Acts in Britain where you can truly and definitively say that it is prompted primarily by pressure from below. That contributes to the other Reform Acts in their way, but this one really very sizably. Now, there are some MPs who are in favour of reform from first principles because they just believe in the widening of the franchise to reflect the industrial and commercial changes that are happening in Britain. But in this case, when you see this degree of danger, where you see the loss of control and 250 fatalities in Bristol alone, many MPs are swayed by the argument that we need to act now to prevent forcible uprisings elsewhere and maybe the destabilization of the aristocracy. Lord Macaulay, a famous historian who was also an MP at this time, described this in the debate before the first rejected reform bill as the parable of Sybil, which is the idea that, she will come back many times and her demands will be higher each time, by which he meant that if we don't do anything, we don't reform, that there will be more riots, there will be more disturbances, and we will need to grant an even greater measure of enfranchisement to be able to placate this. The debate in 1832, even amongst most of its proponents, is essentially this. What is the minimum that we as the aristocracy, the enlightened elite, who know what we should do, who have the country's best interests at heart, what is the minimum we can do to assuage the pressure? There is only a very tiny and vanishing number of MPs, as I say, who are in favour of it for its own sake. And so they very much are thinking about literally saving their own social status, but doing so in a way that gives the bare minimum of what is required to quell the uprising and to push back the storm.
If it was attempted to exclusively give the bare minimum, how did those first votes on the Reform Act come to fail within the parliamentary system?
Well, I think simply because for a large number of MPs, and we must remember that the first votes on this were taken when there was still a Conservative or a Tory majority in the House of Commons, were opposed to reform on principle, that it didn't really matter whether the measures were minor or whether they were major. The principle was that you were trimming the tree. This is the Whig argument, you see. You change the Constitution, you adapt it, you evolve it, just like they did, in 1688 by putting William and Mary on the throne. That the question then, if you are a Whig, is how much trimming do you do? But if you are a Tory, the point is that the Constitution is something organic that has grown with time. it's not something that men of a present moment should tinker with, because the moment one tinkers with it, another will tinker with it a few years later. You will open the door towards essentially universal suffrage, which is what Robert Peel actually predicted would happen. He said that the Whigs had opened the door that wouldn't be closed when they passed the Reform Bill. No matter how minor that was, no matter how small, slightly ajar the door was, Peel thought that the whole door would just crash open and in less than a century would have universal suffrage. And he was right.
And during the successful passage of the Reform Act under the Whig government, how does this come about?
Well, I think that the crucial event that we have to think about here is actually the election of 1831. Now, this occurs because the Wellington government falls. There is a general election, and the Whigs do about as well as it is possible to do under the unreformed system. Now, elections prior to 1832 as being barometers of public opinion is not really an established precedent. Most of the seats are controlled by bribery. Most of them are controlled by patrons. The Duke of Newcastle on his own controls 50 constituencies where he basically puts the MPs in. Or very often MPs are just appointed by the local corporation, i.e. the sort of the council, as it were. But in this system, in this election of 1831, all of the constituencies which are vaguely open, and there are a few of them that are very open because the franchise is so inconsistent, the Whigs do spectacularly in all of these. They don't win the election by a landslide because a lot of seats are still in the pockets of their opponents, literally, but they do about as well as they could do. And so it is interpreted like a landslide, even though it isn't one on paper. Anyway, then, obviously, Earl Grey, then Prime Minister, tries to pilot a Reform Act. He gets it through the Commons, but it is blocked in the Lords. And various lords, like Lord Ashley or the future Lord Shaftesbury, a famous reformer later on, lead the Lords in opposing this because it's dangerous radicalism, it's upending the organic basis of the Constitution, it's also empowering the House of Commons, and probably means the end of the personal influence of many of the Lords themselves. Because, of course, the Lords, being an entirely hereditary chamber and, of course, not being elected, find themselves very much in disconnection to the Commons here. The Commons has been reforged by this storm in 1831. The Lords has not been. And the Lords does not see it as its responsibility to simply mirror the view of the House of Commons because it doesn't have, the Salisbury Convention. It doesn't have democratic principles. So the Lords are quite happy to block it.
And so how does Grey respond to the Lords blocking the bill?
He performs a very clever deal with the king. It is very similar, in fact, identical to a deal that was done to conceive the Parliament Act many, many years later in 1911 with George V. He convinces William IV, who is an opponent of reform, that the situation is now so dangerous because you have the days of May, the widespread rioting, because of the international situation that we mentioned, that the Lords are incapable of consenting to their own disempowerment. And so, therefore, a patriotic monarch should side with the Commons. And Grey, through conversations that are unrecorded but would undoubtedly have been very interesting, persuades William to create Whig peers artificially using his royal prerogative to create a Whig majority in the Lords. That is exactly the same as the gun that was placed to the Lord's head with the Parliament Act as well, although in that case the creation of Liberal peers. And so therefore, faced with that, the Lords has no alternative essentially but to back down. And in that also creates an important constitutional precedent that the Commons, with the monarch on side, can overpower the Lords.
And why would the king pick a bill that would be for royal assent, that would be so anti-Lords and especially monarchical power in favour of what is ostensibly common sovereignty?
So the king's starting position was that the Reform Act should not pass and did not need to pass. The king is aware of the popular discontent, but his initial opinion is to side with the Duke of Wellington, is to side with Peel, that there does not need to be reform and that these problems are primarily economic or prompted by the international situation. But it is, I think, really some of the crucial key moments, the loss of control of Bristol being one such, and the torturing of the Duke of Newcastle's castle, which is another, which really convinces the king that now is a time where he's going to have to act. I mean, we have to remember that the role of the king constitutionally is very undefined at this point. It's vacillated in terms of the power of the monarch. You had initially, after the Hanoverian succession, where we had the Georges placed on the throne, a series of quite weak monarchs. You then have George III, who is actually a very powerful monarch, gets a lot of power back for the monarchy. George IV, very unpopular during the Regency period. The monarchy actually worrying about existentially its own role. And then you have William IV, in this situation, the new king, in the context of that international situation where you have a conservative anti-reform monarchy being destabilized. And so the king is probably practicing some of his own Whiggery by trying to actually side with the reformers because he's afraid that potentially his own role could be compromised. He could end up in the same way as Charles X in France.
And so finally, it's granted royal assent. What actually are the provisions of the Great Reform Act that are so contested?
Once the principle of reform is established, and that is very controversial, there is then a huge argument about the details. Detail number one is, where do you put the franchise? In other words, who's in and who's out? So there's a very obvious way you can determine that, and that is through property valuations. And that is a principle that is used throughout the 19th century. Now, prior to this, there were all sorts of different franchises that existed. Mostly it was property values, but there were some very arbitrary ones in there as well, such as window diameter in some places, whether you got some salt out of a pit and showed it to the returning officer, all sorts of nonsense, the so-called potwalloper boroughs, that was the cooking pot diameter term. And so this is all swept away with a unified property qualification. It is based at £10 rateable value in boroughs, £50 in counties. The borough franchise is lower than the county franchise. That is the case throughout the whole 19th century until 1884. Now, that effectively, although of course it does vary because the price of property varies throughout the country, brings upper middle class people in and generally keeps lower middle class people out. It depends a little bit, as I say, on property values. But who is going to come in to the franchise and is going to be part of the constitution and who isn't is something politicians argue about. Because what kind of a person are you bringing in? Well, are you going to bring in a respectable shopkeeper, for example? Is that the kind of man that you want to have the vote or not, as the case may be? And so there's a bit of argument there. But where there is perhaps a still bigger argument is where they draw the constituency boundaries. In particular, how many MPs are you going to still have in so-called rotten boroughs, or at least, if not rotten boroughs, decomposing boroughs? In other words, places where there are only a few hundred voters and where bribery is probably going to be the operative determinant of an election. Because, of course, if you have seats that are controlled by patronage or controlled by plutocracy, it enables people to buy their way into Parliament without having to face electorates. And that is a system of representation, not of people, but of certain other things, influence and plutocracy, that the aristocracy very much wish to continue in the constitution. And so there's very much an argument about how many MPs various places should get and how many rotten boroughs that there actually are. But just like with all of the Reform Acts, once all those things are placed in the mix, no one really knows exactly how they're going to land.
And so with the £10 property qualification, £50 elsewhere, how did this and later consequential issues such as the Poor Law Amendment inspire greater reform movements further down the line?
I think in a variety of ways. I think one of the first things is that by enfranchising the new industrial constituencies, having MPs for Manchester and Birmingham as dedicated things and of themselves, not only do you have a new class of voters who are being represented, you also have a new class of MPs who start appearing as well. In other words, those who do well before quite large popular electorates. It's not really a surprise that Birmingham develops its own political colours, although much later in the 19th century as being a place of municipal socialism. Manchester, that great city of free trade, you get politics and politicians who start appearing because those places have been given representation. And many of them are the foremost reformers who represent these kind of new boroughs. And they're the ones who propose a lot of bills. Because governments are not elected with manifestos in this era and party leadership is very weak, it is often a private member who places a bill on the statute book. And so having just a small number of very reform-minded MPs in the Commons can make the difference between you getting a piece of reform and you not getting a piece of reform. And so I think that's the really crucial point, that by opening the system, a bunch of people who are reformers really with a capital R get seats in the Commons and start pushing through bills, for example, the change to the poor law.
And much of this bill is debated about its lasting significance and its genuine greatness. It's known as the Great Reform Act, and yet still only about 18% of adult males are enfranchised, and women formally are excluded. What is the lasting significance of the Great Reform Act?
Well, I think it probably should be called a Great Reform Act, despite those extremely meagre qualifications. Certainly, when looking at the history of democracy, it sometimes seems a bit counterintuitive when we compare this to, say, 1918, which enfranchised, 15 million people. Why a measure like this, that just increases the franchise to about 18% of men, should be so critical? I think the thing is it looks critical, I think, in posterity. First of all, you have the beginning of reformist politics and the beginning of new party structures, although that, i.e., Whigs and Tories giving way to liberals and conservatives. But I think the particular thing that it does is probably what Robert Peel said that it would do, which is that once you have the franchise as a man-made mark, a place that has been defined at £10, then it can change again. Not only is it the case that more people might get £10 houses and so increase the franchise organically, but it is also the case that even in the 1840s, you have reformers like Russell saying, what happens if we put it down to 7? What about 6? And then by the 1860s, that's what the argument is, that there's been a spread of education, there's been the spread of the press, the middle class have become more conscious. Maybe you do want to widen the franchise, given the fact that the economy, culture, and society are changing. So the fact that you've already lowered it to 10 and it's not destroyed the Constitution means that you can then chip away at it and lower it even more. And of course, if you keep doing that, and there is always a reformist movement who wants to change the franchise, and of course, political advantage at any given moment to changing the franchise, as there always is, then it's not a surprise that there are then more reform acts. And so that's why it really detonates all of the others, even though the actual effect isn't that great. It massively changes political culture. It means that in an election, a government can be replaced, which is not something that could really happen before, which is a pretty important principle. It promulgates further reform itself, and it establishes two-party politics in a new way. For all of those reasons, I think it is well worthy of the name great.
1832 comes across as a period of time that was incredibly charged. It's an incredibly electric time period in British politics, akin to the recent decade that we've had. How has that felt?
I think it would have been felt literally throughout the entire country, whether you were someone who had no prospect of being enfranchised. For example, you were an agricultural laborer, you were a woman. You would have known that a crisis was in the offing, that this would have been something not only that would have been published in all newspapers, news sheets, that there would be meetings that would be happening literally on every street corner, that you might have noticed that actually it wasn't possible for you to withdraw gold from the bank because there'd been a sort of a bank raid. All sorts of things would have manifested themselves in political consciousness. There was undoubtedly a real electricity running through the country, a feeling that everything was to play for. And as far as the government was concerned, a real sense of not understanding what the people would do, a fear of the herd, a fear of what public opinion, if it was mobilized by the demagogues and the reformers, to what extent they would actually go. And that focusing of attention on a particular political event, which would have meant news traveled from one end of the country somehow, not by electricity, but by something else, very, very quickly, was, I think, a really, really intense feature of this election and this period of time that I don't really think has got any equal throughout the 19th or the 20th centuries. And that is one of the reasons why it is so. The Reform Act is called a great one, not because of the measures, not necessarily even because of the results, but because of the great focus and the great zeitgeist and the great electricity that was generated. And it was something that was never forgotten and was recalled for decades since.
Touching on those that were newly enfranchised in this Great Reform Act and the slippery slope of reform, going into the actual 1832 election, how did those that were newly enfranchised affect the voting and the outcomes?
Well, in two important ways. One is by casting their ballots, but the other is, of course, by comprising new constituencies. Almost all of the constituencies are changed, their boundaries for many of them are remapped. And so it's not clear how these constituencies are initially going to vote. I should say there's probably a little less uncertainty with this election because still bribery is very important. It's a bit more possible to work out who's going to vote which way before polling day. But it is generally perceived that the new voters, the propertied middle classes who were amongst the vanguard of the reform movement, alongside the working classes, who of course don't get the franchise, primarily vote Whig and are pro-reform. At the same time, though, even though the Tories are smashed in this election as they expected to be, they do detect that there are certain, shall we say, more anti-reform strains of opinion, even amongst those who have got the vote. And so it's certainly not the case that Toryism is bankrupt. I think, if anything, they probably see some aspects of hope that they did not think that they would see in the ruins of 1832. And so while it's true that those middle-class electors are initially Whig, with some reform, it is actually possible, the Tories think, when they are Conservatives after 1834, to get that back again.
If they were initially Whig and eventually the Conservatives still haven't lost their hope during this campaign, what were the actual issues of the campaign now that reform had supposedly been achieved, and what was on the agenda?
Good question. So the first thing is really, what does politics look like after reform? After the Reform Act, if you read the speeches of the election, a lot of it is about still the Reform Act, just saying, well, I supported reform, it's happened, vote for me. And then obviously being quite difficult for opponents of reform to say, well, I opposed it, but now it's happened, so etc. So that's still important. But there are also, I think, some understanding that with a reformist majority in Parliament, that it may be possible to do certain other reforms. Now, of course, elections in this period don't have manifestos. There are moments where there are national issues. And so it's not exactly that Whig candidates are saying, well, we're going to carry the Municipal Corporations Act or the change to the Poor Law or abolish slavery throughout the British Empire. But there is certainly a principle of reform with a capital R in the abstract, that some Whigs will call themselves reformist or Reform Party, not to be confused with Reform UK, rather than Whig. And so there is the general principle that if you elect a Whig government, that there will be further reforms, and that reform is a general guiding principle. The trimming of certain parts of the Constitution, including in local government, which is also a very sacrosanct area, is something you can expect a Whig government to do. And so there's that general reform versus we've had the Reform Act, let's just stop kind of argument that consumes the Whigs and the Tories.
And so coming out of this campaign with reform as a capital R, what were the actual results of the election?
So you have a massive Whig landslide. The Whigs winning, although it's not entirely possible to calculate the precise number, 479 seats, the Tories winning about 175. So, taking into account some other kind of independent MPs in there as well, the Whigs have got a majority of about 250. And that is important because in politics in this period, because a lot of MPs are very independently minded and are calling themselves lots of different things, it's very hard to apply the party whip. And so, if you have a majority of 250, you are probably going to be able to pass bills whenever you want to, even given a large number of absentee or flaky supporters. And so I do think the size of the Whig victory does help them push through some of the more kind of controversial legislation, as opposed to a small majority where they would actually have been very vulnerable to defeat.
And if there was more of an independence of MPs, how does this election and the Reform Act shape the development of parties and a more national structure?
Well, because MPs traditionally did not run under party labels, they would just run under their name, and they might even say, well, I'm a Whig, but at the same time, I'm not really very reform minded. Or someone might say, I'm a liberal Tory, to use a term that has often been referred to throughout history. That what starts dropping away, I think, in the context of a nationalized election where there is this Reform Act and then there are some national issues that appear, is that kind of independent status. That what a Whig means starts to mean throughout the whole country someone who is pro-reform. That what a Tory means is probably someone who wants to constrain the amount of reform, probably who opposed the 1832 settlement. And that creates a nationalized discourse around quite more partisan political parties. Now, of course, one thing that's critical in elections in this period is actually running candidates. Running candidates is very, very expensive, especially in a political culture where there is loads of bribery. It is very hard for someone who's not a multimillionaire to even run, or equivalent of a multimillionaire, to run for office. And so, because there is a consistency between what the candidates are standing for from constituency to constituency, it's much easier for money to flow nationally behind particular political causes, rather than just having to be raised by a certain gentleman who wishes to campaign to get himself into parliament. So you have actually a quite large mobilization of money behind politics, and not all of that is local. And so once you start getting that, and you start getting a national party that appears, suddenly the government starts calling itself, well, we're the Whig government and we have a Whig mandate, and so therefore we will perform this kind of policies, rather than Parliament just being a representative chamber where there are 650 different mandates, and government emerges as a sort of a natural consequence for that. In 1832, while we can't go into the mind of electors there, I think it is undoubtedly the case that huge numbers of voters were voting for a party before they were voting for an individual. And it is understandable, therefore, that the politics that then emerges has a more party-centric focus, certainly throughout the 1830s and right really up until the death of Peel.
And looking at the development of future parties coming down the line, almost a century later, Labour gets into power. And how did acts such as the Great Reform Act impact working class movements as they are still left unenfranchised?
Immediately, it doesn't enfranchise them at all, and it doesn't give them any formal representation. But it does do one very important thing, which is that the lead up to reform, and obviously the Reform Act itself, where there is the sense of widespread betrayal of the working classes, that they help the middle classes up the ladder and then the middle classes kick the ladder away, creates and detonates a culture of political organization and excitement, and indeed even class consciousness amongst the working classes, because they are the group who are politically excluded. And from that is obviously birthed the Chartist movement, that famous working class popular movement dedicated to achieving the famous points of the People's Charter: universal male suffrage, secret ballot, payment of MPs, equal constituencies, and annual parliaments. 4 of those things were, of course, enacted in the years that followed. The only one that was not, of course, was annual parliaments. And Chartism is an enormous movement, monster public meetings, vast support amongst the working classes, and indeed is able to run its own MPs in many places, or own candidates, and win seats in the Commons as well. It isn't ultimately a successful movement, because one of the curious aspects of British history is that in the 1840s, while there were revolutions kicking off throughout the continent, Britain on that very same year, 1848, sees actually the end of the Chartist movement in a failed meeting on Kennington Common. But it is still a movement which greatly energizes working class consciousness, and one could argue is re-energized later in the 1860s when there is a real push for working class enfranchisement. And if we want to take the real longue durée and think about working class political consciousness right up to the birth of the Labour Party, Chartism and the Chartist tradition of working class political mobilization and its intersection with trades union organization as well, which is important, is something that is a consistent motif from the beginning, from 1832 onwards. And so while the Chartists don't succeed and the working class don't get the vote in any capacity until 1867, there is still a lasting legacy of organization there that stretches well into the 20th century.
And moving beyond the Reform Act and looking instead at the capital R of reform and the slippery slope of reform that the moral storm talks about, how did figures across the Atlantic, such as Samuel Sharp, and figures in the UK, such as Thomas Falwell Buxton, shape issues after the election of Earl Grey?
Well, I think that one thing that happens is the detonation, I think, of politics also is an increasingly moral debate. Now, while there are critical changes to things like local government, there are also arguments about who should matter and why. So, for example, the new Poor Law Amendment Act, for example, what do you do with paupers? How responsible are they for the fact that they're not able to self-support them, so they're not able to support themselves? What should government do? And the other one, of course, perhaps still more celebrated, is, of course, relating to slavery. Now, slavery, of course, has already been abolished, the trade, that is, in 1807, which was almost also an enormous kind of sort of moral debate. But there is then, through persons such as Buxton, the imperative to push this moral dimension further, that it's not just simply a question of the actual trade itself, but obviously it is still going on, because there are still slaves who are working, even if they were traded previously. And so it's then a question of going to the next stage, which is actually emancipating the slaves, emancipating 800,000 slaves throughout the British Empire, and indeed putting considerable resources into ending the trade within the very large British Empire. And so I think the moral of that story is actually the introduction of moral consciousness in politics, that you have campaigns that are led by conscientious reformers who get seats in Parliament through the Reform Act and are able to lead those kind of moral campaigns, including even campaigns like this, which were extremely expensive for the British government to be able to finance, requiring something like 40% of the national tax take to be able to actually pay for the compensation that was doled out to the slave owners following that act. And so I think that there's a greater feeling that there is a connection between what happens in Parliament and moral debates in the country as well. And that's not just reform. There's rising consciousness that comes with rising nonconformist consciousness as well that also matter here, a re-engagement with more evangelical Christianity throughout the 19th century as well. But there is now an outlet in politics for those moral questions to enter Parliament much more easily than they had been, for example, with the abolitionist campaign before the Great Reform Act, when Parliament was much more closed.
This is also an incredibly important time for Ireland. And in the wake of Catholic emancipation, the Irish Repeal Party do successfully in 1832. What does it mean looking at the election, and how is Ireland impacted by the election?
So it's important, I think, to remember. So 1829, you have Catholic emancipation. Catholics formally, because of the Tests Act, formally prevented from voting, taking seats in Parliament, and 1829 changes that. But at the same time, it also hugely restricts the Irish franchise, just as a little amendment, that having given political rights to Catholics, that they are then effectively taken away by a property qualification. Now, 1832 redresses some of that, and you have, as you say, the Repeal Party doing quite well in this election and giving the O'Connell Party a base to, for example, campaign against tithes, the tithe of the Church of England in Ireland, which was, obviously something that many Catholics thought was unjust. And I think perhaps primes Ireland for a huge moment of politicization in the 1840s, which is when, of course, the Great Famine begins. And so I think the legacy of 1832 is really, I think, to allow O'Connell, one of these great men of Irish politics, who is able to create Irish political consciousness in the first stage, which is continued by Parnell in the second stage, gives them, I think, a platform to promote Irish political consciousness, and especially Irish political consciousness in opposition to the Union and the government at Westminster. And so I think without that, and without O'Connell being able to continue that campaign, it's not as clear that you would have had that political consciousness in Ireland, and there wouldn't maybe have been such a reserve, such a cachet for those who obviously were campaigning about the famine and then campaigning in the land war later to be able to draw upon. So I think it keeps Irish politics relevant and politically mobilized, which is instrumental moving forwards right up until partition.
1832, it seems, is a great time of not only reform but also moral questions within politics and of political consciousness. For those that are more interested in issues surrounding that, do you have any further reading recommendations?
Yes, I think so. And I think that there are several things that need to be read about. I think it is the particular circumstances of 1832 and the story that it entails. I also think that there are questions about what 1832 actually does in terms of its practical operations. And then I think a more general question about some of the moral aspects of it. So I have three recommendations particularly. One would be an old book, but many of the best books on elections are quite old, Michael Brock, The Great Reform Act. For the actual operation of the Reform Act, in terms of what happens in elections, by far the best is Philip Salmon's Electoral Reform at Work, which really gets into the nitty-gritty. And then for, I suppose, a more dramatic account, which also includes some of the much more moral questions, Perilous Question by Antonia Fraser, also, I think, helps recreate some of the real drama and some of the zeitgeist, which is critical, I think, to understanding the 1830s, because it's not just what happened on paper. It was also, I think, a revolution in people's hearts and minds as well. And so trying to find out what it really felt like is, I think, particularly important in this totemic general election.
Luke Blaxill, thank you for joining us on the Observations podcast, hosted by Democracy Volunteers, looking at the 1832 election. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
The Observations podcast is being brought to you by Democracy Volunteers, the UK's leading election observation group. Democracy Volunteers is non-partisan and does not necessarily share the opinions of participants in the podcast. It brings the podcast to you to improve knowledge of elections, both national and international.